On a gray October morning in Providence, Rhode Island, an old woman in a worn wool coat stood at the bottom of the stone steps of Marigold Academy, holding a dented tin box against her chest with both hands. She was 78 years old. She'd walked a long way that morning, and she wasn't entirely certain anymore why she'd come. All she wanted was a bowl of soup from the little campus cafe. It was Founders Day, and the steps were crowded with donors in expensive coats, waiting to have their picture taken. A woman in a burgundy blazer, with a principal's badge around her neck, looked the old woman up and down the way you'd look at something the wind had blown in off the street, and said, loud enough for every parent standing there to hear, that this was a school, not a shelter. The old woman said quietly that she had money. She opened the tin box to prove it, and her hands were shaking so badly the lid rattled against the rim. Nobody moved. Every well-dressed person on those steps found something else to look at, and the principal called for security. And that's when a young woman in a gray sweater, already late for the most important interview of her life, stopped halfway up the steps and turned around. She had $6 in her pocket, and every reason in the world to keep walking. What she didn't know was who that old woman really was, and what one bowl of soup was about to cost her. If you enjoy stories about dignity and second chances, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still counts for something, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to those stone steps, and to the moment one tired young woman decided she wasn't going to walk past. Adeline Marsh turned around and hurried back down the steps so quickly that the approaching security guard had to stop short. She moved between him and the elderly woman, turned her back toward the woman, and spread her arms slightly, assuming the same posture she had used hundreds of times in the schoolyard when children shoved one another. The guard looked at her, then at the woman in the burgundy blazer. He didn't know what to do with a slender young woman in a gray sweater who was still clutching a stack of job applications. The woman wearing the principal's badge descended one step. She asked who Adeline was and whether she was related to the elderly woman. Adeline said she wasn't related to anyone there. She was simply passing by and happened to have eyes that could see. Someone in the crowd gave a quiet laugh, then immediately fell silent. The other woman pressed her lips together, and her voice dropped into the low tone of someone accustomed to giving orders without needing to raise it. She said Adeline was causing a disturbance at an event attended by parents and donors, and that she should know her place. Adeline heard those two words clearly. She heard them so clearly that heat rushed into her face. She spoke loudly enough for all 20 people on the steps to hear, saying that the woman had just declared this was a school, not a charity, and that was wonderful, because a school was the first place in this world where people should learn how to treat an elderly woman standing at the door. And if this school couldn't teach that, then perhaps she should reconsider what she was selling to the people who had just written her checks. No one said anything. A man standing near the back quietly cleared his throat and turned away. The woman in the burgundy blazer stared at Adeline for a long time, then took a small notebook and pen from her pocket. She asked for her name. Adeline stated it clearly, first and last, and even spelled her last name again when she saw the woman writing slowly. The woman closed the notebook, said Adeline would regret this, then turned back toward the donors, with a smile fixed upon her face so swiftly it was almost unbelievable, and told everyone they should take the photograph now because the light was beautiful. The crowd dispersed like water flowing around a stone. The security guard remained for a few more seconds, then walked away as well. Adeline turned around, and the elderly woman was still standing there, with both arms wrapped around the tin box, gazing at her like someone who had just watched something happen very far away. Adeline asked whether she was all right. The woman shook her head, then nodded, then said she only wanted a bowl of soup. Adeline held out her hand, and the elderly woman leaned on it. Adeline felt the woman's entire weight settle onto her arm, and she understood that this woman could barely remain standing on her own, that she had endured the whole morning through willpower alone. The small cafe stood behind the main building, its windows clouded with steam, and only a few people were inside. Adeline pulled out a chair for the woman at the table farthest in the back, hidden from view of the steps. She went to the counter, reached into the pocket of her sweater, took out everything she had, poured it into her palm, and counted. She counted twice. She looked at the menu board hanging on the wall, then back at the money in her hand, and ordered one bowl of soup and a cup of hot tea. The young woman behind the counter asked whether she wanted anything for herself. Adeline said she had already eaten lunch. The words came smoothly, because she had spoken them so many times in her life that they no longer felt like a lie. She carried the bowl of soup to the table and placed it before the elderly woman, then opened her cloth bag took out the paper-wrapped sandwich she had brought for dinner, unwrapped it, and pushed it across the table. The woman looked at the sandwich, then at Adeline. She asked what Adeline was going to eat. Adeline said she had already eaten, repeating it once more. The woman picked up the spoon, and her hand trembled so badly that nearly all the soup spilled from it the first time. Adeline quietly moved her chair a little closer and placed one hand on the woman's elbow, not supporting it completely, only steadying it, the way she did with children who were just learning to write. They sat in silence that way for a long time. The elderly woman ate slowly, very slowly, and finished everything. Then she set down the spoon, wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, folded the napkin into a small, tidy square, and asked Adeline her name. Adeline told her. The woman nodded and softly repeated the name once, as though testing whether it fit something inside her mind. Adeline smiled and asked the woman's name in return. The woman didn't answer immediately. She looked through the glass, her eyes moving slowly across the courtyard from one end to the other, like someone searching for a signpost that should have been there. The silence lasted long enough to make Adeline uneasy. Then the woman turned back and said her name was Rose. Adeline told the elderly woman to remain there, in that exact place, and not to go anywhere. She said she only had one thing to do, that it would take about half an hour, and then she would return. The woman nodded and said she knew how to wait, that she was very good at waiting. Adeline hurried down the hallway with the stack of applications in her arms, and by the time she pushed open the door to the small meeting room on the second floor, she was more than 20 minutes late for her appointment. 3 people sat behind a long table, and the person in the middle was the woman in the burgundy blazer. Adeline paused in the doorway for exactly one breath. The woman looked up, and this time she smiled, a very courteous, very warm smile, and invited Miss Marsh to come in, saying they had been waiting for her. She introduced herself as Bianca Whitlock, the principal of the academy, and said she was eager to hear Miss Marsh's presentation. The other 2 people remained silent, one of them looking down at his phone. Adeline sat, placed her file on the table, and began speaking about the years she had taught 3rd grade at a public school in the southern part of the city, and about the morning reading program she had developed herself for children who were 6 months behind their classmates. Bianca didn't look at the file even once. She opened a folder of her own, removed a sheet of paper, and interrupted with a very gentle question, asking whether Miss Marsh would like to explain to the board why her contract at her previous school had been terminated. Then, without waiting for an answer, she read aloud. She read one line at a time, slowly and clearly, the section stating that the teacher had refused to follow an administrative directive concerning a student's academic results, the section saying that the teacher had repeatedly expressed opposing views during meetings, and the final section, the one that described all of it in 3 words, an adversarial attitude. She set down the paper, folded her hands together, and said that Marigold placed cooperation above everything else, that the parents there paid a great deal of money for their children to be educated in a harmonious environment, and that a person with a history of confrontation would find it very difficult to fit in. The man seated beside her finally looked up from his phone, checked his watch, and said nothing. Adeline understood. She understood that the interview had ended before she ever entered the room, that it had ended outside on the stone steps at the precise moment she turned around. She gathered the file against her chest and rose. She didn't raise her voice because she had no breath left for raising it. She thanked the board for their time and said that Mrs. Whitlock was entirely correct, that it was truly difficult for her to fit in. Then she spoke one final sentence, saying she would rather work somewhere without pay than stand before a classroom in a school that considered driving an elderly woman away from its door perfectly normal, because the children sitting inside learned far more from what adults did on the steps than from what adults wrote on the board. She opened the door and walked out. She heard Bianca say lightly to the other 2, "There, you see?" Adeline didn't stop. She walked the length of the hallway, descended the stairs, left the main building, and moved faster with every step until she was running. She ran around the courtyard, across the lawn, and toward the cafe with its steam-clouded windows, then pushed open the door so hard that the bell on the frame rang sharply. She looked toward the table farthest in the back. The chair was empty. The table had been wiped clean. The only thing left on its surface was the dented tin box with its lid closed. Adeline stood in the middle of the cafe for a moment, then walked over, pulled out the chair, and sat in the exact place where the elderly woman had been. She opened the lid. Inside were several almond cookies neatly arranged on a layer of yellowed wax paper. And at the very bottom folded into quarters, was a piece of paper torn from the edge of a napkin. The handwriting trembled, each letter crowding into the next, written in pencil. "Thank you, child." Beneath those words was only a single initial. Adeline folded the note, returned it to the box, closed the lid, and sat in silence. The young woman behind the counter called out to ask whether she needed anything. Adeline shook her head. Beyond the glass, applause drifted from the steps in steady waves, and people were still taking photographs. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, a man sat on a plastic chair in the middle of the bare concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse at the far end of the Providence harbor. No one had tied him up. No one stood behind him. The rolling door of the warehouse was wide open toward the water, broad enough for a truck to drive through, yet he remained seated as though he had been nailed to the chair. A few paces away, Salvatore Ferraro stood facing the open door, holding a paper cup of coffee and looking out at the line of cranes along the docks. He didn't look at the man in the chair. He wouldn't look at him once that entire morning. In the ordinary tone someone might use to ask the time, he asked where the workers' wages from the previous month had gone. The man in the chair said there had been an accounting problem and that he was handling it. Salvatore took a sip of coffee. He said he hadn't asked what the problem was. He had asked where the money went. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of water striking the pilings. And then the other man said he was in debt, that he had gambled and lost, and that he would repay every cent. Salvatore gave the slightest nod without turning around, and said that all 42 workers at that construction site had families, rent due at the beginning of the month, and children whose school fees had to be paid, and that the man had known all of that on the day he put his signature on the paper. The man in the chair began to apologize. Salvatore cut him off. He said an apology couldn't pay anyone. He said the man had 2 days, and during those 2 days, he would visit every home, knock on every door, return the money with his own hands, and explain with his own mouth what he had done with it. Enzo Carbone would accompany him, Salvatore added, but not to help. The man in the chair asked what would happen if he couldn't gather enough money. Salvatore finished the last of his coffee, crushed the paper cup in his palm, and said that in that case, he should begin immediately. Then he turned away. He walked toward the door without another word, because in the Ferraro family, there were 3 things people learned by heart from an early age. Salvatore never repeated himself. He never became angry because anger was for men who had no choices left, and people didn't come to ask, they came to repay. The door remained wide open. The man on the plastic chair was left alone in the empty warehouse, and he remained seated for a long time before he dared to stand. Outside, Enzo opened the car door, then hesitated before speaking. He said that the lady of the house had left before the sky was fully light, that she hadn't told anyone, that she had told the housekeeper she would only be gone for a little while, and that she still hadn't returned. Salvatore was about to get into the car. He stopped. Very slowly, he placed the crushed paper cup on the roof, and for 3 seconds, he said nothing. Then he told Enzo to send people to search everywhere, and not to cause a commotion. At noon that same day, several miles from the harbor, Adeline Marsh was walking toward the bus stop with the tin box cradled against her chest when a black car pulled up to the curb directly in front of her and blocked her path. The rear window lowered. Inside sat a middle-aged man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, wearing a dark coat, and he didn't step out of the car. He asked whether she was the teacher who had caused trouble at the academy that morning. Adeline said she hadn't caused trouble for anyone. The man smiled, a very gentle smile, and said he only wanted to offer her one piece of advice. He said she had a family, and people with families should choose stable places to work, places with fewer complications, places that didn't involve them in other people's affairs. He said that school would soon have a great many problems, and she shouldn't stand too close to it. Adeline asked who he was. The man didn't answer. He extended a white card through the open window. It was entirely blank, with no name and no title, only a string of numbers printed in the center. He said that if she changed her mind, she should call, and if she didn't, that was fine too, because he was only delivering a message. Then the window rose, and the car drove away, disappearing into the midday traffic. Adeline remained on the sidewalk, holding the tin box in one hand and the white card in the other, unable to understand a single word of what had just happened. The apartment the 2 siblings shared was in the basement of an old building on the western side of the city. Its only window was a narrow strip of glass near the ceiling at sidewalk level, so throughout the day, they saw more passing feet than sky. Sam Marsh sat on the floor with his back against the leg of a chair and an open book in his lap, practicing a game he had invented after his hearing aid broke. He covered the ear that could still hear and watched people's mouths, trying to guess their words. He was 9 years old, and he had become suspiciously good at it. When Adeline opened the door and stepped inside, he looked up, drew an exaggerated breath through his nose, and announced that she had gone to a restaurant without inviting him, that she smelled like pumpkin soup, the kind made with cream, and that he could smell everything. Adeline bent down, kissed his hair, and said she had been exposed, caught by a tiny detective. Sam said the tiny detective charged 1 cookie for his services, and when he saw her open the tin box and take out a real almond cookie, his eyes widened. He said he had only been joking, then ate the whole thing in 4 bites. He asked where such a beautiful box had come from. Adeline said it belonged to a new friend. Sam asked how old the new friend was. Adeline said very old. Sam nodded with great maturity and declared that older people usually made better cookies, and that was simply a law of nature. Then someone knocked on the door. Adeline knew that knock. She told Sam to go into the other room, put on his old headphones, and watch the cartoon she had already downloaded onto the tablet. Sam went because he was a child who understood very quickly when adults didn't want to speak in front of him. Doreen Marsh entered, sat in the only chair in the kitchen that was still sturdy, and placed an already opened envelope on the table. She said she had received it from the building management, that they had sent a copy to her because her name was still on the old lease, and that this was the final notice. Adeline didn't pick up the paper. Doreen continued in her gentlest voice, the voice people use to soothe children to sleep, saying that she didn't blame Adeline for anything, that everyone went through difficult times, but that she couldn't stop thinking about her brother, about Ray, about all the years he had worked 2 shifts in a row, about the morning the school called her from the mechanical room, and about who he had done all of it for. She spoke the final words very softly, then left them resting between them. Adeline asked about the medical records. Doreen pretended not to remember. Adeline explained more clearly that she meant all of Sam's hearing examination records from the time he was small, that the insurance company required the originals before it would consider replacing his device, and that she had been asking Doreen for them since spring. Doreen said the papers had become mixed in somewhere among her brother's belongings, and that she would look for them. Then she took another set of papers from her purse, placed them on the table, turned them so Adeline could read them, and said that while she was there, she had something else to discuss. She said the insurance company from Ray's former workplace had approved a payment for his dependent minor, that the money could only be released to the legal guardian named in the documents, and that the process would be much faster if the person named had a stable home and a steady income. Adeline only needed to sign where the pages were marked. That was all. Doreen would handle everything else. Adeline stared at the papers for a long time. She said Doreen didn't want the boy. She wanted Adeline's signature. Doreen blinked, then smiled, and said Adeline made everything sound so unpleasant that she only wanted what was best, and that Adeline could think about it because there was no need to hurry. She rose, picked up her purse, and left both sets of papers on the table. Before walking out, she turned back and added that she would search for the medical records whenever she had time. The door closed. Adeline sat in silence for a while, then went into the hallway, closed the door behind her, and sat on the concrete step beneath the yellow light. She took all the money from the pocket of her sweater, poured it into her palm, and counted. She counted twice, exactly as she had that morning at the cafe counter. This time, there wasn't even a bowl of soup to buy. Sam's laughter drifted through the crack beneath the door, and Adeline Marsh bowed her head over the loose change in her hands and wept without making a sound, so the boy inside wouldn't hear anything. Adeline's phone vibrated the following afternoon with a call from a number she didn't recognize. The caller introduced himself as Enzo Carbone, his voice courteous and concise, like someone accustomed to speaking on the telephone all day, and said he was calling on behalf of someone who had shared a bowl of soup with her at the cafe on the grounds of Marigold Academy during Founders Day. Adeline asked how he had found her number. Enzo said she had written it on her job application and that someone had recorded her name in a notebook. He said the elderly woman had returned home safely, that she had mentioned leaving behind a box, and that if Adeline still had it, the family would be very grateful to have it returned. They would send a car to collect her. Adeline said she could make her own way there. Enzo read the address, and after hearing it, she had to ask him to repeat it. The bus traveled along the bay, passing neighborhoods where the houses stood farther apart and the fences rose higher. Adeline got off at the final stop and walked a long way with the tin box cradled against her chest. The iron gate was already open. A stone driveway led through the grounds to a large house facing the water, with a broad veranda and windows stretching from the floor to the ceiling. She stood below the front steps for a moment and looked down at her gray sweater before pressing the bell. The person who opened the door wasn't a housekeeper. It was the elderly woman. She stood there wearing a neat cream cardigan, her silver hair smoothly arranged in a bun at the nape of her neck, her back much straighter than it had been the previous day, and she looked at Adeline with openness, kindness, and courtesy. It was the gaze of a hostess receiving a guest she had never met. She smiled and said hello, asked whether Adeline was the new teacher, and invited her inside. Adeline froze on the threshold. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The elderly woman continued holding the door and smiling, then apologized for the house being a little untidy that day, and told Adeline to sit in the living room while she asked someone to prepare tea. Adeline could hear her heart beating in both temples. Softly, she said, "Ma'am, I'm Adeline. I'm the person from the school the other day." The woman tilted her head, her expression still pleasant and utterly unfamiliar, and said, "Is that so? How wonderful." Then her eyes fell to Adeline's hands. They fell to the dented tin box, to the indentation in one corner of the lid, and to the long streak where the paint had peeled away. The elderly woman stared at it. She stared for a long time without speaking, and Adeline saw the hand holding the door slowly tighten. Then the woman released a breath like someone who had just broken the surface of deep water, and in a completely different voice, she said, "You're the girl who bought me soup." Adeline nodded. The elderly woman reached out and touched the box, then began to cry. She wept right there in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame and the other resting on the tin, saying again and again, "I'm sorry, child. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." Adeline stepped forward and took hold of her elbow, and this time, she supported her fully. They sat in the spacious living room overlooking the water, while the elderly woman clutched the box against her chest like a lifeline. She said she hadn't forgotten Adeline. She explained that sometimes everything inside her mind was as bright and clear as a light being switched on, and other times, usually in the morning, usually just after she awakened, that light suddenly went out. She would find herself standing in the middle of her own home, without knowing what she had intended to do, without knowing what year it was, and sometimes she would walk out the door and travel a great distance without remembering why she had left. She said it didn't come gradually, the way people imagined. It came in waves, and each time the water receded, it carried away another piece, and that piece never drifted back. Adeline asked whether she had told her doctor. The woman nodded. Then Adeline asked whether she had told her family. The elderly woman remained silent for a long time, gazing out across the water, before saying that her son didn't know. She said he had lost his father when he was far too young, that people had taken him away that very morning, and he hadn't been able to see his father one last time, that through all the years since then, she was the only person he had left, and that she hadn't yet found the courage to tell her son that the next thing he was going to lose would disappear slowly, one piece at a time, right before his eyes. Then she turned back to Adeline, her eyes still red but her voice steady once more, and said that was precisely why she had sent someone to find her. The elderly woman placed the tin box on the low table before her and turned it so the dent faced her, then said her name was Rosalind Ferraro, and that Rose was what her mother had called her when she was a child. So when only one name remained inside her mind, that was the name left behind. She said she hadn't lied to Adeline that day. That was simply all she had been able to say. Then she told her story, and she told it only once. She never returned to it, and never told it again afterward. She said that when she was young, her mother worked the night shift at a textile mill in the northern part of the city, and that many children from immigrant families in the neighborhood worked during the day to help support their homes, so none of them could attend school. She said the priest at St. Anselm Church allowed her and her mother to use the basement beneath the main sanctuary, a damp room reached by several concrete steps descending from the rear street, and they opened a school there at night. Classes began at 9 o'clock, she said, because the children didn't finish work before 9. Tuition was one loaf of bread if a child's family had one, and if they didn't, then it didn't matter. The child could come anyway. She said the first 34 desks were built from the wood of fish crates, and the smell of that wood lingered for years. She said her mother had only one rule. Anyone who walked down those concrete steps was entitled to sit at a clean desk, and no one was permitted to ask which child's family was poorer than another. She said that little school eventually grew, moved out of the basement, became a proper school, then became Marigold Academy, with the stone steps and white columns where Adeline had stood the other day. She paused there for a while. Then she said she hadn't disguised herself that day to test anyone's character. People would tell the story that way, she knew, because people always preferred that version. The truth was that she had awakened that morning, put on the oldest coat in her closet because she believed it was still winter in a year-long past, picked up the box of cookies, and walked out the door toward the school because only one task remained in her mind. She had to bring cookies to the children. By the time she reached the bottom of those steps, she could no longer remember why she was there. She was simply hungry. She only wanted a bowl of soup. Then she said the light inside her mind came back on at the precise moment that woman called security. And in that instant, she saw everything that had happened to what her mother had left behind. Adeline asked why she had searched for her. The elderly woman looked at her, and there was no softness at all in her answer. She said she hadn't searched for Adeline because Adeline was kind. This city had no shortage of kind people, she said. The streets were full of them. She had searched for Adeline because she had done what she did while believing with absolute certainty that Rosalind had nothing to give her in return, and that was the only kind of evidence Rosalind still trusted. Then she continued, and this was the truth at the heart of it. She was approaching the day when she would no longer remember whom she had trusted. When that day came, none of her signatures would carry any value. Every instruction she had given would be dismissed as the confused words of an old woman, and anyone who wished to speak for her intentions would be able to say whatever they pleased. So she had to choose someone now, while the light was still on. And she had to choose correctly the first time, because there wouldn't be a second. She said the Marigold Foundation still existed, that it controlled the scholarship program, the old building, and even the land on which the school stood. She wanted Adeline to become the foundation's program director. The position was appointed by the foundation, so the school board had no power to remove her. The salary wasn't very high, but it was enough to live on, and the first thing Rosalind wanted her to do was restore every scholarship place that had been eliminated. Adeline sat in silence. She said Rosalind was entrusting something enormous to a person she had met only twice. The elderly woman replied that she was entrusting it to the only person whose kindness had never made her wonder why. The living room door opened, and the man who entered didn't knock. He wore a charcoal gray suit, the creases still sharp along the sleeves, and he paused in the middle of the room when he saw a stranger seated across from his mother. Rosalind introduced them, saying that this was Adeline Marsh, and that this was her son, Salvatore. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at Adeline for exactly 2 seconds, then turned to his mother and said she needed to rest and that he would speak with Miss Marsh. Rosalind started to say something, but after looking at her son for a moment, she thought better of it. She rose with the tin box in her hands, and before leaving the room, she rested one hand very lightly on Adeline's shoulder. The door closed. Salvatore didn't sit in the chair across from her. He pulled over another chair, turned it around, sat down, and placed a thin file on the table, though Adeline hadn't seen him carrying it when he entered. He didn't open it. In an even voice, he said that Miss Marsh had been born in Providence, studied education at the State University, and graduated with honors. He said she had taught 3rd grade at a public school in the southern part of the city until the previous spring, that her contract had been terminated after she refused an administrative directive, and that ever since then, her file had remained on an internal district list that no one officially acknowledged existed. He said she was currently 3 months behind on her rent. He said she was the legal guardian of her younger brother, that the boy's hearing aid had been broken since spring, and that the insurance company hadn't replaced it because the original records from his earlier hearing examinations were missing. He said she had an aunt who was withholding those records, and that the same woman had recently given her a set of papers to sign. He said that at noon, she ate in the cafeteria at the school where she worked as a day-to-day substitute, and that in the evenings, she usually didn't eat at all. Then he stopped. Adeline said nothing. She could hear the heating system running somewhere inside the walls. Salvatore said he hadn't told her all of that to frighten her. He had told her so she would understand that he could bring every one of those problems to an end in less time than an afternoon. He said the rent debt would disappear. The boy would have a new hearing aid within the week. Her name would be removed from that internal list, and if she wished, she would have a teaching position at any school in the state. Then he added, still in precisely the same tone, that she should also understand the opposite was true, that he was entirely capable of leaving everything exactly as it was. He took a checkbook from the inside pocket of his jacket, opened it, signed one check, tore it out, and slid the blank check across the table toward her. He told her to fill in the amount herself. In return, she wouldn't accept the position his mother had just offered her. She wouldn't return to that school, and she would never see Rosalind again. Adeline looked at the check lying on the wooden table. She looked at it for quite a while. Then she raised her eyes and looked directly into his, without lowering them and without blinking. She said he had just done exactly what those people had done to his mother on the steps that day. She said the principal had looked at an elderly woman and decided her worth by the coat she wore, while he had looked at a teacher and decided her worth by an overdue rent notice. The two of them had done the same thing. The only difference was that he was more courteous, and he had more money with which to be courteous. She said she didn't know who he was, and didn't need to know, but she did know one thing. There had been 20 people standing on those steps that day, watching, and not one of them was poor. Then she pushed the check back to the center of the table. She said his mother had asked her a question, and she would give her answer to Rosalind, not to him. Salvatore Ferraro remained still. He had sat in many rooms with many people on the other side of the table, and every one of them, without exception, had looked away first. This young woman didn't. He lowered his eyes to the blank check lying between them, then picked it up, folded it in half, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and rose. At the door, he stopped, turned his head, and said that Miss Marsh should understand one thing. He never repeated himself. Adeline remained seated. She said she had heard him clearly the first time. 3 days later, in the study on the upper floor of the house overlooking the bay, the Foundation's attorney opened his briefcase before Rosalind and her son. He was an elderly man, with thin, framed glasses, and he explained that because Rosalind had formally filed to begin the transfer of authority over the Foundation's land, a provision in the original trust had automatically taken effect. Salvatore asked which provision. The attorney said it had remained dormant since the trust was established, binding no one through all the years since, because it could be activated only at the precise moment when the founder voluntarily began the transfer process. And that moment had now arrived. Then he turned to the page marked with a paperclip and rotated the file so Salvatore could read it. The words weren't typed. They had been written by hand in blue ink, the script slanting to one side, and Salvatore recognized it immediately because only 2 things bearing that handwriting remained in his possession: a birthday card and a scrap of paper with a telephone number written on it. His father had written that the heir to this land would receive control only after working directly at the school for 90 days, performing whatever duties the school assigned, and taking direction from the head of the program rather than from the family. Beneath that was one more sentence. His father had written that anyone who couldn't endure those 90 days shouldn't be entrusted with the land either. Salvatore reached that sentence and stopped reading. He asked in what year the document had been written. The attorney gave him the date. Salvatore sat in silence. He calculated it in his mind and understood that when his father had written those lines, he himself had still been a boy, not yet 11 years old, still sleeping upstairs, still being awakened and sent to school every morning. Very softly, almost as though speaking to himself, he said, "He already knew what I would become." Rosalind said he hadn't known. He had only been afraid. Salvatore asked whether she had known about the provision. She said she had. He asked why she had chosen to begin the transfer now, after leaving it untouched for so many years. Rosalind looked at her son and said, "Because I can still sign my name now." That answer remained between them for a long time, and Salvatore asked nothing more. He pulled the file toward himself, picked up the pen, and signed. He didn't look at his mother as he did it. He signed because he had never been allowed to see his father's face one last time, because they had put him on an airplane that very morning and told him it was for his own protection. And even now, those slanting lines in blue ink were the closest thing he possessed to words his father had spoken directly to him. Early the following Monday morning, he arrived at Marigold Academy. He didn't drive through the main gate in his private car. He parked in the outer lot and walked inside like everyone else. People recognized him immediately in the hallway of the main building, and they moved aside without understanding why they were doing it. Bianca Whitlock emerged from the principal's office, and when she saw him, her face lit up. She hurried toward him, saying what an honor it was, that she hadn't been informed of his visit, and that the school would prepare a proper office for him upstairs. Salvatore said he didn't need an office. Bianca smiled and asked what he did need. He said he needed to know who would be assigning his work. Her smile stopped halfway across her face. At that moment, The door at the far end of the hallway opened, and Adeline Marsh stepped out wearing the same gray sweater, a stack of files cradled in her arms. She saw them and stopped. Bianca followed Salvatore's gaze. She looked at Adeline, then back at Salvatore. And over the space of 3 breaths, she understood, and every trace of color drained from her face. Without raising his voice, Salvatore said that he had come to receive his assignment, and he asked Miss Marsh what she wanted him to do that morning. The task Adeline assigned him that morning was to go down to the old building at the far end of the campus, the row that had housed the school's first classrooms when it was founded, and inventory everything there that could still be used, because she intended to reopen evening classes in that building, if it could be repaired in time. She told him he would be working with Gus Petrakis, the school's maintenance supervisor. Gus was over 70, short and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands, and he wore an old canvas apron with 2 front pockets filled with every kind of screwdriver. He led Salvatore from one end of the building to the other, showing him where the roof leaked and where the door frames had rotted, speaking about each room as though it were an old acquaintance. Salvatore followed, took notes, asked about the cost of materials and the time required for construction, and posed the questions of a man who had built dozens of projects far larger than that row of rooms. Then they reached the last room, and as Gus knelt to open the cover of an old electrical panel and explained how many times he had patched it over the years, Salvatore watched him for a moment and made a remark. He said he couldn't understand it, that Gus was clearly a skilled man, and that after all those years with hands like his, he should have built something worthwhile of his own instead of spending his entire life patching an electrical panel in someone else's basement. He didn't say it harshly. He spoke as though he were making an obvious observation. Gus didn't rise immediately. He tightened the final screw, closed the panel, then braced one hand on his knee and stood. He looked at Salvatore and asked whether Mr. Ferraro knew who had built the first desks in that school. Salvatore didn't answer. Gus said he had built them. He said he had been very young then, that the wood had come from fish crates at the harbor, that they had begged for the nails, and that he and the founder had sat planing the boards by lantern light until nearly dawn. The smell of that wood had clung to his hands for an entire month. He said there had been years when the school couldn't pay its wages on time, one year when the payments had fallen 4 months behind, yet he had still come to open the doors every morning, because if he didn't open them, no one else would. He said nearly every tradesman working on the campus that day had been taught by him from the first day they arrived. Then he said he could live with poverty, because he had lived with it his entire life, and was accustomed to it. But he couldn't live with the way Salvatore had just looked at him. Gus reached behind his back, untied his apron, folded it neatly into quarters, and placed it on the wooden table. Then he took the ring of keys from his pocket and set it beside the apron. The keys made a hard, dry sound against the wood. He said he was resigning, said thank you, then walked out the door. Salvatore remained alone in the room beneath the leaking roof. That afternoon, he returned to the house by the bay and told his mother what had happened. He told it like a man reporting a personnel problem, saying that the maintenance supervisor had abandoned his position without permission at the precise moment they needed him most, and that he would have someone find a replacement within the week. Rosalind sat in the armchair beside the window, one hand resting on the tin box as usual, and listened to everything. She asked no questions. She didn't become angry. She spoke only one sentence. She said that in the year his father died, she had lain helpless in her room for an entire season, and every morning, Gus had been the one who opened the school doors. Then she stopped. She turned toward the window and looked out over the water, and she didn't say another word. Salvatore stood there waiting for her to continue. He waited for her to scold him, to explain, to tell him the rest of the story, because he was accustomed to people continuing to speak until he finally agreed to listen. But she said nothing. The silence lasted so long that it began to carry a weight of its own, and Salvatore realized he was standing in his own mother's living room without knowing what to do with his hands. At last, he said he would take care of it. Rosalind continued looking out over the water. She said he should tell Miss Marsh that because at the school, she was the one who assigned his work, not his mother. The following morning, Salvatore told Adeline that the maintenance supervisor had resigned and that he would have someone hire a replacement. Adeline set down her pen and said no. His assignment for that day was to ask Gus to return, and if he couldn't persuade him, he could report to the Foundation that he had failed to complete his assigned task during his first week. Salvatore looked at her for a moment, then told Enzo to prepare the car. Near the end of the afternoon, the car broke down on a road cutting through the old industrial district. and Enzo said he would call for another vehicle, which would arrive in about 40 minutes. Adeline opened the door, stepped out, and said that in 40 minutes it would be completely dark, and Gus went to bed early. She pointed across the road, toward a corrugated metal shelter, beneath a faded sign, and said that the 4 o'clock bus was still running. Salvatore didn't move. She told him he was welcome to remain there and wait for the car while she went ahead. But if he wanted Gus to believe he was sincere, he should get there himself instead of having someone drive him to the door. Salvatore got out. There were no seats left on that bus. Salvatore Ferraro stood gripping an overhead rail among people who had just finished their afternoon shifts, surrounded by the smell of machine oil and cold food inside paper bags, standing as straight as a pillar, while the crowd swayed and pressed around him at every turn. Several stops later, a pregnant woman boarded and remained in the aisle because there was nowhere to sit. Salvatore looked around. No one rose. He had occupied an empty seat near the door for exactly 2 stops, but he stood, quietly invited her to sit, then moved toward the back and took hold of the rail again. The woman thanked him. Adeline stood some distance away and said nothing. Gus lived on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building without an elevator. He opened the door wearing his clothes for home, looked surprised, then invited them inside. Salvatore entered and stopped abruptly in the middle of the room, because the walls, from one end to the other, from eye level almost to the ceiling, were covered with photographs. Every one of them was a class photograph. In the farthest corner were yellowed pictures in black and white, showing children arranged in 3 rows before a concrete wall. There were faded color photographs taken in front of the row of rooms, with the leaking roof that Salvatore had inspected the day before. There were newer, brighter photographs taken on the stone steps beneath the white columns. Dozens of pictures hung closely together, and Gus didn't appear in a single one. Salvatore stood before that wall for a long time. Then he turned, opened his mouth, and couldn't make the words come. He stopped, cleared his throat, and tried again. This time, he managed the first few words before his voice failed him once more. Gus didn't hurry him. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets and waited. On the 3rd attempt, Salvatore finally managed to say it all. He said he was sorry. He said that the day before, he had spoken words he had no right to say, that he had judged Gus's work through the eyes of a man who had never had to do anything with his own hands, and that he had no excuse. Then he said he had come to ask Gus to return, and that if Gus chose not to, he would understand. Gus studied him for a moment. Then he asked how the 2 of them had gotten there. Adeline said they had taken the number 4 bus. Gus burst out laughing. He laughed loudly, laughed until tears filled his eyes, then said that if something that strange could happen, he supposed he could come back. He went into the other room, returned with a spare ring of keys, handed it to Salvatore, and told him to be there at 7 o'clock the following morning, and not to be late. On the journey back, they stood on the bus again, though it was less crowded this time. Adeline said she hadn't believed he would agree to take the bus. Salvatore said he hadn't believed it either. Then he asked why her contract at her former school had been terminated. Adeline remained silent for a while before explaining briefly that a child had submitted work that wasn't his own, that the boy's father had recently made a large donation to the school, that the administration told her to overlook it, and that she had refused. She said she had thought she would regret it, but she still didn't. Salvatore looked through the window at the streetlights drifting past and said that where he came from, people like her didn't last long. Adeline said it was the same where she came from. Gus truly was there at 7 o'clock the following morning, and within only 2 weeks, the first room in the old building had a roof that no longer leaked, working lights, and a door that could close properly. Adeline reopened the evening class there, beginning with just over a dozen children from families whose names remained on the old scholarship list that Mrs. Whitlock had ordered erased several years earlier. The assignment Adeline gave Salvatore that week was to drive the children to and from class. He didn't argue. Every afternoon, he drove the school's 16-passenger van through several neighborhoods on the western side of the city, stopping at each arranged corner and waiting until every child was aboard before continuing. In the evenings, he drove the route in reverse to take them home. Within a week, he had learned all their names because they talked throughout the entire journey, and not one of them had any intention of lowering their voice. One rainy evening, the van returned earlier than usual, and Salvatore remained in the hallway to wait for the lesson to end. He sat on a wooden bench against the wall just outside the classroom door, while the children read inside. They read aloud together, out of rhythm, some too quickly and some too slowly. One child kept stumbling over the same word and beginning again from the start, and their voices drifted through the gap beneath the door into the darkened hallway. Salvatore sat quietly and listened. He remained there for a long time, longer than necessary, and when he finally rose and walked toward the lobby, he saw the boy. The child was sitting alone on a chair with an open book in his lap, and his feet swinging above the floor, waiting for someone. Salvatore immediately noticed the device behind his ear, a small beige hearing aid with a loop of clear tape wrapped around the connection. The tape yellowed with age. He stopped. The boy looked up, stared directly into his face, and asked quite naturally whether he was the driver, because his sister had said the driver was very stern. Salvatore said yes. He was the driver. The boy nodded thoughtfully, said that was good, then lowered his head and resumed reading. Adeline emerged from the hallway, and when she saw the two of them there, she hurried over. She said this was Sam, her younger brother. Sam said the man was a very stern driver. Adeline told him to go inside and get his coat, and when the boy had gone, Salvatore asked how long the hearing aid had been broken. Adeline said since spring. Before he had time to think, he had already taken the checkbook from the inside pocket of his jacket, and he said someone would take the boy for a new hearing assessment the following morning. Adeline didn't push his hand away. She looked at the checkbook, then at him, and quietly asked him to put it away. He asked why. She said because the boy was standing just beyond that door, because he was 9 years old, and because he was very good at reading people's lips and guessing their words. She said that if he learned that night that he was getting a new hearing aid because his sister had stood in a hallway and accepted money from a man, then the first thing he would hear through that device would be that truth. Then she said she would manage it. It would take time, but she would manage. Salvatore stood still. He closed the checkbook, returned it to his pocket, and said nothing more. Not long afterward, the Foundation office received a notice stating that the Hearing Assistance Program for students and employees' relatives, established in the 1970s and later discontinued, had now been reactivated through a new donation. The donor's name had been left blank at the donor's request. The Foundation secretary called Adeline and asked whether she knew who it was. Adeline said she didn't. She sat in her office looking at the notice for quite a long time, then approved it with her signature, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. The following afternoon, when the 16-passenger van stopped at the familiar corner, she stepped onto the entry stair and handed the driver a paper cup of coffee without saying a word. Salvatore accepted it without saying anything either, then drove on. The diner stood on a corner in the northern neighborhood, the kind of place that had opened before the area was given its new name, and the man at the table farthest in the back had been sitting there since morning. Salvatore entered, and the server brought coffee without asking either man what he wanted. Rocco Ferraro added more sugar to his cup, stirred slowly, and said he had heard that his nephew had recently taken to driving a school bus. He didn't say it mockingly. He spoke like a father discussing a child who had chosen a profession he couldn't understand. Salvatore sat down. Rocco said he remembered the day they called to tell him what had happened to his older brother. He said he had been in his 30s then, unmarried, knowing nothing about children, with no one else left in the family. He said he had been the one who went to the airport to bring the boy home from across the ocean, the one who sat in hospital hallways through the nights when the boy was sick, the one who borrowed money to keep people from tearing the Ferraro name apart and devouring it piece by piece during the years that followed. He said he wasn't recounting those things to collect a debt. He was telling them so his nephew would remember that the chair he occupied today hadn't simply appeared beneath him. Salvatore said he remembered. Rocco nodded, took a sip, then came to the heart of the matter. He said he had heard everything about the transfer, about the foundation, and about how his nephew was having attorneys untangle every thread until everything appeared spotless on paper. He said he understood why. He said he had wanted the same thing once, when he was young, when he still believed that if he made himself clean enough, people would open their doors to him. Then he asked his nephew whether he remembered the year their family applied for permission to build the market in the southern neighborhood. The year when every document was valid and every tax had been paid in full, yet their application still remained untouched in a drawer for 11 months because of the surname written at the top of the page. He said the society Salvatore was trying to enter had never opened its doors to their family. It opened them only wide enough to take their money, then close them again. He said Salvatore was trading his own blood for a seat at the dining table of people who would never invite him to sit. Salvatore said he wasn't trading anything for a seat. He only wanted the generations who came after them to be spared the life that his uncle and his father had lived. Rocco remained silent for a long time. Then he said, very well. They would talk business. He said he held Gerald Whitlock's debt, and it wasn't a small one. The man had pledged almost everything he possessed as collateral, and the only things he had managed to retain were his seat on the school board and his seat on the foundation board. Rocco had allowed him to keep those 2 seats because he needed him to occupy them. He said the land beneath the school was the final parcel obstructing the entire western corridor of the harbor district. That if Salvatore completed the transfer, the land would remain permanently in the hands of a charitable foundation, and no one would ever be able to touch it again, and that it was the final card Rocco still held. He set down his coffee cup very gently and said he wouldn't allow his nephew to give that card away for nothing. Salvatore asked what his uncle intended to do. Rocco said he didn't intend to do anything yet. He was giving his nephew time to reconsider, and he was a patient man because he had been patient with that boy since Salvatore hadn't yet reached his waist. That afternoon, when Salvatore told Adeline about the meeting in the foundation office, he mentioned his uncle's name. Adeline stopped with a cup of water in her hand. She walked to her desk, opened a drawer, took out a white card, and placed it on the table before him. She said that the day after the incident on the steps, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair had blocked her path in a car, advised her to find a more peaceful place to work, and given her this. Salvatore picked up the card. It bore no name and no title, only a string of numbers printed in the center. He studied those numbers for a long time, then said he knew that number. Adeline's phone vibrated near midnight, and the caller was Enzo. He said the lady of the house was gone. He said the back door had been left unlocked, that her coat was still hanging on its hook, that they had searched the entire house, the grounds, and the shoreline, and that it was raining outside. Adeline asked where Salvatore was. Enzo said he was already out searching. Within half an hour, cars were moving along every road around the bay. People were stationed at bus stops, and others were entering hospitals one by one to ask whether she had been brought in. Adeline put on her coat, told Sam to go to sleep, locked the door, then stood beneath the awning and called Salvatore. She asked where he was searching. He named several streets around the house. She said Rosalind wouldn't be there. He asked why. Adeline said she was trying to return to a place, and that place wasn't her home. She gave him the address of St. Anselm Church in the northern part of the city, and told him to go around to the rear street, where several concrete steps led down to the basement. Salvatore asked how she knew. Adeline said Rosalind had told her once. His car arrived first, and Adeline came afterward. When she stepped out of her car, she could see them from the end of the street. Rosalind was sitting on the second step from the bottom, with her back against the concrete wall and the tin box clasped in both arms. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair clung to her temples, and she was gazing toward the end of the street. No one dared approach her. Several men stood some distance away in the rain, their hands hanging at their sides, uncertain what to do. Salvatore stood at the foot of the steps and called to his mother. Rosalind turned toward him. She studied him for a very long time, then smiled gently and asked him to move aside because he was blocking the way. She said the children would be arriving soon. She said they didn't finish their shifts at the mill until 9 o'clock, that every one of them walked, and that some lived all the way across the bridge, so they were often late, but they always came. She said she had brought cookies, pointing to the box in her lap, and explained that the last time, one of the children hadn't eaten anything all evening and none of the others had known, so this time she had come prepared. Then she turned and resumed watching the end of the street. Adeline climbed the steps and sat beside her. She said nothing about the children, and didn't tell her that no one was coming. She removed her coat and draped it over Rosalind's shoulders. Rosalind allowed it to remain there. After a while, she turned to look at Adeline, and beneath the dull yellow streetlight, something in her eyes slowly changed, like a door opening and then closing again. In a completely different voice, she said very softly that she knew what time it was now. She said she knew no one was coming. She said she even remembered Adeline's name. Then she said that forgetting wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was remembering again, because in those moments, she knew exactly what she had just lost. Adeline took her hand. Salvatore remained at the foot of the steps beneath the rain, and he didn't climb them. Then he knelt. He knelt directly on the wet sidewalk, both knees against the concrete, lowering his head beneath his mother's as she sat above him, and took her other hand. "Mom," he said, "I'm here." Rosalind looked down. She reached out, touched his hair, and smoothed it back the way people do with children. "Yes," she said, "I know. I still remember you." And Salvatore Ferraro, the man who had never raised his voice to anyone in his life, the man no one throughout the Western Harbor dared look directly in the face, bowed his head over his mother's hands and wept. He wept aloud in the street, beneath the rain, before all his men standing some distance away, every one of them turning aside at the same moment. Rosalind continued stroking his hair. "Come now, child," she said. "You're soaked through." Then she told him to take her home. Doreen Marsh filed a petition to change Sam's legal guardian at the end of the month, citing unstable living conditions as her reason. Adeline received the summons one afternoon, read it from beginning to end, then folded it and placed it in a drawer before Sam came home from school. The first thing she did was call the court and ask that her younger brother not be required to attend. She had to call 3 times before reaching the right person, and she explained that the boy was 9 years old and didn't need to sit in a room listening to 2 adults argue over who was entitled to sign which paper. The court granted her request. That morning, Sam stayed home with Adeline's friend from the same floor, and the last thing he said to his sister before she left was that she should remember to bring home bread, the kind with seeds. In the small courtroom on the 3rd floor of the family courthouse, Doreen sat at the opposite table with her attorney. She was neatly dressed, her hair carefully arranged, and she presented her case with great composure. She said she was Sam's aunt, that she owned a home and had a steady income, while her nephew lived in a basement apartment and his current guardian was behind on the rent. Her attorney submitted a copy of the notice. Then he added that his client merely wanted the insurance payment process completed as quickly as possible for the child's benefit. The judge asked whether Adeline wished to say anything. Adeline rose. She had no attorney. She said she wouldn't dispute the apartment because it truly was in a basement, and she wouldn't dispute the rent because she truly did owe it. Then she said there was one thing she wanted to say there. Once, and never again. She said her father had worked in maintenance, that he had worked 2 shifts for more than 10 years, and that he had done it so she could attend school. She said she had lived all those years believing he had worked himself into exhaustion because of her, that perhaps he could have rested if she hadn't continued her education, that she had been the price he was forced to pay. She said she had believed it because someone had repeated it to her many times in a very gentle voice, and she had accepted it because she thought accepting it would be easier. Then she said she was giving it back that day. Her father hadn't exhausted himself because of her. He had worked that way because he loved his daughter, and because he hadn't been given a kinder choice, and that had been a father's decision, not a child's sin. She said what he left his 2 children wasn't a sum of money, and anyone in that courtroom who believed it was had never understood him. She said her younger brother could read, laugh, and tease his sister, and that he had never once asked her which floor their home was on. Doreen remained silent and didn't raise her eyes. The judge questioned her about the medical records she was withholding, asking why she hadn't turned them over, despite having been asked to do so since spring, and neither of her 2 answers was clear. The hearing ended before noon. The petition was denied. The court ordered Doreen to surrender every document relating to the child within 7 days. Adeline walked into the hallway, descended the stairs, and pushed open the large doors to step outside. The sunlight was so bright that she had to raise one hand to shield her eyes. At the foot of the courthouse steps, a man stood waiting with both hands in his coat pockets. Salvatore didn't ask about the outcome. He didn't say a word. He simply took a neatly folded handkerchief from his pocket and held it out to her. Adeline accepted it and stood there wiping her face, realizing only then that she had been crying without knowing when it began. Then she asked how long he had been standing there. He said since morning. When the repairs to the old building reached the final room, the work was obstructed by an iron door at the end of the lower hallway. A door, Gus said, led to a storeroom for broken equipment and had been locked for a very long time. That Saturday morning, he brought down the entire ring of keys and tried them one by one. The key that finally opened the door was so rusted that he had to turn it with both hands. Inside were several metal shelves crowded with broken desks and chairs, cardboard boxes, and old coils of electrical wire. Salvatore and Adeline carried everything outside, 1 load at a time. When they reached the lowest shelf, Gus stopped. He stood looking at it for a while, then bent down and pulled out a steel toolbox whose blue paint had almost entirely peeled away. A length of rope had been looped around its handle because the latch was broken. He placed it on the floor and wiped the dust from the lid. A strip of cloth tape, stiffened with age, had been fixed across it, and someone had written on the tape with a marker in faded capital letters that could still be read, R. Marsh. Adeline was walking past with a broken chair in her hands. She set it down. She asked Gus who the box had belonged to. Gus spoke the name. He said the man had worked at the public school and came there on weekends to repair the boiler, the roof, and anything else that needed fixing, never accepting a penny, year after year. He said the man had left the toolbox there one Saturday because he still had work to finish the following week, but the next week, he never returned. Adeline asked why Gus hadn't thrown it away. He shrugged and said he had always believed the man would come back for it one day. Adeline knelt on the floor. She untied the rope and opened the box. Inside were wrenches, screwdrivers, a roll of electrical tape, and a flashlight whose batteries had leaked, all arranged in orderly rows by size. Every tool had a strip of tape wrapped around its handle, the same kind of mark she had seen on everything in the kitchen drawer throughout her childhood. At the bottom of the box, pressed between 2 layers of cleaning rags, was a photograph. It was a black and white picture, yellowed at the corners, showing a group of children standing in 3 rows before a concrete wall. Every child was thin, and every one wore an oversized shirt with long sleeves. Adeline turned it over. The back was filled with names written carefully in a woman's hand, arranged in 3 lines corresponding to the 3 rows of children in the photograph. She traced them with one finger. When she reached the 2nd row, she stopped. She remained seated on the concrete floor for a very long time with the photograph in her hand, and no one in the room dared ask her anything. That afternoon, she and Salvatore took the photograph to the house by the bay. Rosalind was sitting in the armchair beside the window, and it was one of her clear days, one of the days when the light inside her mind remained on from morning until night. Adeline handed her the photograph. Rosalind held it in both hands, moved it a little farther away so she could see clearly, and fell silent. Then she began speaking very softly, naming each child one by one as she moved across the 1st row, and she didn't get a single name wrong. When she reached the 2nd row, she stopped, touched the face of a boy standing near the end, and laughed. She said that boy arrived half an hour early every day to clean the blackboard for her mother, and that his family was too poor to ever bring bread. Adeline asked the boy's name. Rosalind spoke the name of Adeline's grandfather. Rosalind then looked up, saw Adeline's face, and remembered. Adeline quietly asked what Rosalind's mother had been named. Rosalind spoke the name Adeline. Sitting on the concrete floor, Adeline finally understood. Her grandfather had passed down that story of kindness to her father, Ray. Her father had named her after the woman who gave his family dignity, and spent every weekend of his life silently repairing that building to repay a debt no one had ever asked him to repay. It began with a stack of transfer files Adeline had to review before the old building could be reopened for use. Among the records of periodic inspections for the heating system and boiler, there was one report for every year. Every report declared the equipment safe, and every one had been signed by the same company. She turned through them again and again. The signatures were identical, so perfectly alike that even the angle of the writing and the places where the pen lifted matched exactly. She searched the company's name, and it took her less than an afternoon to discover that the registered owner was Gerald Whitlock's brother-in-law. She asked Gus when someone had last physically gone down there, opened the system, and inspected it. Gus thought for a moment, then said it had been so long that he couldn't remember. The following morning, Adeline brought the entire file to the board meeting. She gave a brief presentation, laid the reports beside one another on the table so everyone could see for themselves, and proposed closing the old building until an independent company could inspect it again. Gerald Whitlock sat at the head of the table. He listened to everything, then said that Miss Marsh had been there for only a few months, and perhaps didn't yet fully understand how the school operated. He said that the anniversary celebration had already been scheduled to take place in that very building, that invitations had been sent, guests had accepted, and they couldn't postpone such a major event because of a stack of old papers. He said that if she wanted an inspection, she could submit a formal request through the proper channels, and the board would consider it at the end of the quarter. Adeline asked what the board would be considering if they waited until the end of the quarter and something happened while 100 people were standing beneath that roof. No one answered. The meeting moved to the next item. That afternoon, Adeline went down to the old building, told Gus to get every worker outside, then locked all 3 doors herself, posted a temporary closure notice on the main entrance, and called the city's building safety inspection office directly. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She didn't notify the board, the foundation, or Salvatore. Gus watched her post the notice and asked whether she understood what she was doing. Adeline said she did. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a letter arrived from the board office. Gerald Whitlock held a seat on the school board and another on the foundation's board of trustees, and it was because of that second seat that he had the authority to sign the letter. Adeline Marsh was suspended from her position as program director for exceeding her authority, unilaterally interfering with school property, and contacting an outside agency without board approval. The letter instructed her to surrender her keys and vacate her office before the end of the workday. She read it to the end, folded it, and did exactly as instructed. She placed the papers in the drawers, wrote a note for the secretary about several scholarship applications, still awaiting approval, left the ring of keys on the desk, and walked out. A short while later, the city inspectors arrived. They opened the system and remained down there for most of the day. Their findings, sent to the school office, stated that the equipment had exceeded its safe operating life by several years, that the inspection reports in the file didn't correspond to any physical examinations, and that continuing to run the system at the capacity required for a large gathering carried a very high risk of catastrophic failure. They ordered its use discontinued immediately. The anniversary celebration was moved to the main building. No one was harmed. Not one line in the inspection report mentioned the name of the person who had called them. And Adeline Marsh's suspension remained in effect because no one withdrew it, and because on paper, she truly had violated procedure. That evening, she sat in the basement apartment listening to Sam read aloud in the other room, and thought that this was the second time in her life she had lost a job for the same reason. The first time, it was because she refused to alter a grade. This time, it was because she refused to wait until the end of the quarter, and she realized that if she were given the choice again, she would do exactly the same thing both times. The petition was filed the following week, and Rocco Ferraro was the petitioner. It asked the court to declare that Rosalind Ferraro no longer possessed the legal capacity to make decisions concerning her property, and to appoint a member of the family to manage those matters on her behalf. Attached to the petition was a thick collection of medical records, containing examination dates, the results of cognitive assessments, and even handwritten notes from physicians, describing occasions when she couldn't remember the date. When the Foundation's attorney finished reading it, he removed his glasses and told Salvatore that if the court granted the petition, every document Rosalind had signed after the date identified by the other side could be invalidated, including the initiation of the transfer process, the appointment of Miss Marsh, and the disposition of the entire property. Salvatore asked where the records had come from. The attorney pointed to the name of the clinic printed at the top of the page. Salvatore looked at that name, then sat down because he remembered very clearly that many years earlier, when his mother first began complaining that she was becoming forgetful, it was his uncle who had said he would take care of it, that he knew a discreet place, and that members of their family shouldn't be examined at a public hospital where everyone could watch. His uncle had taken her there. His uncle had paid for every examination, and throughout all those years, every sheet of paper documenting another fragment of memory she had lost had been placed neatly inside a file in the drawer of a patient man, waiting for the precise day when it would be needed. Rocco wasn't destroying the school. He was simply erasing his sister-in-law's signature. The court filing contained one small section that the attorney skimmed before returning to examine it more carefully. It was the witness list for the hearing, and it contained only one name, because when Rosalind signed the petition initiating the transfer process at the school office, the person present to witness her signature and certify it according to procedure had been the current principal, Bianca Whitlock. That evening, at her father's house, Bianca held the afternoon edition of the local newspaper in her hands. The article discussed Marigold Academy, a program director suspended for exceeding her authority, and the Ferraro family's attempt to seize control of a long-established educational institution. It also quoted several lines word for word from Adeline Marsh's old personnel file, a file only 3 people in the entire school were authorized to open. Bianca asked her father, who had given the information to the newspaper. Gerald Whitlock didn't answer immediately. He poured himself more liquor and told his daughter not to involve herself. She asked again. He said there were things he had been forced to do because he had no other choice, that he owed people money, and that if he lost his seat on the board, their family would lose everything. Bianca sat down. She asked whether he had been the one who told her not to hire Miss Marsh on the day of the interview. He said nothing. She asked whether he had been the one who told her to remove Adeline from the old building. He still said nothing. Then she asked one final question. All these years I thought I was running a school, but it turns out I was only the hand you used to sign for you. Is that right? Gerald said she didn't understand. Bianca rose and said she understood now. The following morning, She drove to the basement apartment building on the western side of the city and stood in the hallway knocking on the door. Adeline opened it, and for 1 second, she was about to close it again. Bianca said she had come to say one thing, and then she would leave. She said that on the day Mrs. Ferraro signed the petition in the office, Bianca had sat directly across from her, separated only by a desk, for nearly an hour. She said Rosalind had read every page, questioned 2 of the provisions, corrected a spelling error in her own name, and asked whether Bianca was Gerald's daughter and how her father had been lately. She said that if Rosalind had been confused that day, Bianca should have been the first person to recognize it, and she hadn't been confused. Adeline asked whether Bianca understood what she was about to do, and who stood on the other side. Bianca said she did. Then, before turning away, she added one more thing. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I was the one who called security on those steps that day. The old arena in the northern part of the city had belonged to the family since his grandfather's generation, and no games had been held there for many years. Rocco sat in the 3rd row with his coat draped over the back of the seat beside him, and only one bank of lights was on, leaving half the stands submerged in darkness. Salvatore walked up the center aisle and sat 2 seats away from his uncle. No one had accompanied either man. No one stood at the door. Rocco said he had come because his nephew had called, and that he hoped Salvatore had reconsidered. Salvatore asked him one question. On the day his uncle took Salvatore's mother to that clinic, had he already been planning for this day? Rocco remained silent for a long time. Then he said no. He said that at the time, he had taken her there because he was genuinely worried, because she was his sister-in-law, and only 2 adults remained in the family. He said he hadn't kept those papers because he intended to use them either. He kept them because he kept everything. It was the habit of a man who had lived through years when one missing piece of paper could cost a person everything. Then he said that when his nephew began signing one document after another to sever everything Rocco had built, he opened the drawer and finally realized what he was holding in his hands. Salvatore asked whether his uncle truly intended to bring his mother before a court. Rocco said he didn't want to. He said he would withdraw the petition the following day if Salvatore stopped the transfer. That was all he had to do. Nothing else. Just leave the land in the family's hands as it had been for all those years. He said that if Salvatore agreed, then tonight they would still be uncle and nephew. Salvatore sat in silence, looking down at the empty wooden floor below. Then he said there was something his uncle didn't know. He said his father had written a provision concerning that land when Salvatore hadn't yet reached his uncle's waist, that his father had written it in blue ink, and that those words were the only words in this world his father had ever spoken directly to him. He said that on the morning of the funeral, they had put him on an airplane before dawn and told him it was for his protection, and that ever since then, he had never once been allowed to stand beside his father for even 3 minutes. He said he had spent his entire life living by decisions other people had made for him, but not this one. Rocco turned toward his nephew and looked at him for a very long time. Then he asked what Salvatore intended to offer in exchange. Salvatore said everything. He said he would sign over to his uncle his entire interest in every company, every contract, and every family asset that very night, without retaining a single share. He would keep only one thing, the land beneath the school, and before sunrise he would transfer it to a community trust so that neither of them could ever touch it again. In return, his uncle would withdraw the petition. Rocco Ferraro sat in silence for a long time in those empty stands. Then he exhaled and said the boy was more like his father than Rocco had realized. That night, in the attorney's office, documents were printed in stack after stack, and Salvatore signed from around 11 o'clock at night until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Enzo stood beside him, and at one point, he asked whether Salvatore was certain. Salvatore didn't look up. He signed the final page, pushed the stack across the desk, then told the attorney to call the community trust at 7 o'clock. By the time he left the office, dawn had begun to break, and on paper, Salvatore Ferraro no longer owned anything. He returned to the house by the bay while his mother was still asleep. He entered her old study, opened the bottom drawer of the writing desk, and found a cardboard box inside. The box contained envelopes arranged upright in rows. Everyone was sealed. Everyone bore words in her handwriting across the front, and there were dozens of them. Some were marked for holidays. Some were marked for birthdays. One bore the words, "For my son, on the day I no longer recognize you." Salvatore lifted that envelope and held it for a long time, then returned it to its place without opening it. At the far end of the row, the outermost envelope bore a very different inscription, shorter and written at a steeper slant, and he had to read it twice before he could believe he had read it correctly. Open only when you have nothing left. Rocco Ferraro withdrew the petition the following morning, exactly as he had promised. But it wasn't the only petition awaiting the court, because while everything else was unfolding, the Foundation's Board of Trustees, under Gerald Whitlock's signature, had filed a separate motion asking that every recent decision made by the founder be reviewed, including the appointment of the program director, based on the same argument that the person who signed those decisions was no longer of sound mind. The hearing was scheduled for a morning near the end of the month. It was open to the public and held in the auditorium at Marigold Academy at the petitioner's request, perhaps because they believed no one would come. Rosalind sat in the front row with one hand resting on the tin box. Salvatore sat beside her. Adeline sat behind them, no longer holding any position that entitled her to a seat at the front. Gerald Whitlock presented his case first, and he spoke very smoothly, saying that this was something no one wanted, that everyone grew old, and that the board was merely carrying out its duty to protect the assets of a long-established educational institution from decisions made without sound judgment. Then he sat down. The chair asked whether the other side had anything to present. At that precise moment, the large doors at the rear of the auditorium opened. Gus Petrakis stood there, holding both doors, and he kept them open as people entered. They continued entering for a long time. First came the scholarship families, mothers and fathers who had just finished their morning shifts and were still wearing their work clothes, leading one another inside until they filled several rows in the center. Then came others, people who had grown old, some of whom had to steady themselves with one hand on the backs of the seats as they walked. The chair asked who these people were. Gus said they were former students of the school. The chair asked which class. Gus said they were from the class held in the church basement. Then, one by one, they stood. A silver-haired man rose and said he had learned to read in that basement, that he later became a doctor, and that he had only one thing to say. An elderly woman stood and said her family had never been able to bring a loaf of bread, yet no one had ever questioned her about it. A broad-shouldered man, with hands covered in welding scars, rose and said he had come because that school had kept him when, in that particular year, he had nowhere else to go. A woman stood, managed only half a sentence, then sat down again. The entire auditorium was silent. Gerald Whitlock didn't look toward the rear even once. Bianca Whitlock was then called to testify, and when she rose and walked forward, her father turned to look at her, but she didn't look at him. She testified that she had been present and had signed as a witness on the day Rosalind Ferraro signed the document initiating the transfer process. She described that day, explaining that Rosalind had read every page, asked for clarification on 2 provisions she found unclear, corrected a spelling error in her own name, and asked Bianca about her father. The board's attorney asked whether she was certain and whether she understood how her testimony would affect her position at the school. Bianca said she understood perfectly. Then she added that she would also like to submit to the court the original inspection reports for the old building, documents she had kept in the filing cabinet in the principal's office, and that she believed the court would want to examine the signatures on them. The auditorium fell silent once again. The chair dismissed the petition. Every decision made by the founder remained in effect. The suspension of the program director was revoked, and the records concerning the inspection reports were referred to the proper authorities for review. Gerald Whitlock left the auditorium before anyone else rose from their seats. When the proceedings had concluded, the Foundation's attorney asked permission to present one additional matter. He said he had been holding a document Rosalind Ferraro had entrusted to him under seal many years earlier, with instructions that it could be opened only at her personal request, or when the heir no longer held any assets in his own name. He said both conditions had now been satisfied. He opened the envelope then and there. Inside was a deed transferring all of Rosalind's personal shares into a sealed trust in her son's name, established on the very day Salvatore signed the first papers to begin making everything clean. Salvatore turned toward his mother. Rosalind kept her hand resting on the tin box and said, "I was only waiting for the day you chose for yourself." That spring, late one afternoon just as Adeline was locking her office door, Salvatore stood waiting for her at the end of the hallway with an envelope in his hand. There were no flowers. There was no ring box. He handed her the envelope and told her to open it. Inside were documents, nothing but documents. certified copies showing that his name had been removed from every company, every contract, without a single one left behind. Adeline read through them all, then looked up and asked why he was showing her this. Salvatore said he couldn't erase all the years he had already lived, and he had no intention of asking anyone to forgive him for them. He said the only thing he could still decide was how he would live the years remaining to him. Then he said he hadn't come there to buy her. He had come to ask. Adeline folded the documents, placed them back in his hands, and said there was a man who had stood aboard the number 4 bus from one end of the city to the other, so he could apologize to an elderly workman, and she believed that man had earned the right to ask. The following year, Founders' Day was held on those same stone steps. Folding chairs filled the entire courtyard, and among those seated below were families who had come directly from their morning shifts, elderly people who had once studied in the church basement, and tradesmen who had left their work unfinished in the old building to attend. Gus stood at the gate, in the same place where he had stood for decades, and he was the one who pulled away the cloth covering the new sign. Engraved upon it were the words, "No one is ever turned away from these steps." Sam Marsh stepped up to say a few words, and the boy had grown nearly 8 inches since the previous year. Behind his ear was a new hearing aid, compact and beige, without a single loop of tape around it. He said he had been accepted as a student there beginning that fall, that his favorite part of the day was the afternoon reading class, and that his sister had told him to keep his speech short, so he would stop there. The entire courtyard applauded, loudly, and the boy stood at the podium, turned toward his sister, and began to laugh, the laughter of a child who had just heard clearly something he hadn't been able to hear for a very long time. In the last row beside the aisle, a woman sat alone. Doreen Marsh didn't approach anyone, and didn't speak a word to anyone. She remained seated through the entire ceremony with both hands resting in her lap, and when Sam finished speaking, she applauded too. Adeline saw her from the steps. She didn't go down. She only gave the faintest nod, and her aunt nodded back. That was all. Rosalind sat in the front row with the tin box resting in her lap as it always did. It wasn't one of her clear days. When Salvatore came to sit beside her and placed his hand over hers, she turned and studied him for a long time, with the courteous, kind gaze of someone receiving a guest she had never met, then asked who he was. Salvatore didn't withdraw his hand. Rosalind looked around, and when her eyes settled on Adeline standing several paces away, her entire face softened. She said, "But I know you. You're the girl who bought me a bowl of soup." She said she remembered her. Then she turned back toward the man seated beside her, still waiting for an answer. Salvatore Ferraro smiled, gently tightened his hand around his mother's, and said, "I'm your driver, ma'am. I'll take you home." This story tells us something very simple. A person's dignity isn't found in the clothes they wear when they climb the steps, and true kindness is what we offer when we are certain the other person has nothing to give us in return. There are good deeds we perform and then forget, but life doesn't forget, and sometimes it returns them to us when we no longer dare to hope for anything. Please remember that a bowl of soup, a place to sit, or a kind word offered at the right moment can be the very thing that saves an entire life. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day we can listen together to more meaningful stories. How did the story of Adeline and Rosalind make you feel? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to read the thoughts that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.